مصلحا ومجددا فارنوا بنظر طاهر وجنان.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Alhamdulillah, with us today we have our beloved brother Amer Aziz from the United States, and today we will hear how he found the true Islam, Islam Ahmadiyya. Assalamu alaikum, Amer bhai.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, Razi bhai. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. First of all, Razi bhai, my profuse thanks for inviting me to your channel and allowing me to share my story about journey to Ahmadiyya, the true Islam. I'd just like to start off by saying that I don't. I'm not going to speak from a position of authority, in the sense that I'm better than anyone else out there, because I feel that I've found the true Islam. I'm a human being. I have my weaknesses. I have my shortcomings, and there's a lot to be done in this journey. Once you're in Ahmadiyyat and the promised Messiah, al-Islam, who we believe to be the Messiah and the Mahdi foretold by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he's also emphasized on this, that once you enter my Jamaat, once you enter Ahmadiyyat, that is kind of a beginning in itself. And just by signing a document, we haven't really joined that heavenly community, in the sense that there's still a lot of struggles and a lot of hard work to be done after that. And on that point, when we say the true Islam, Ahmadiyya being the true Islam, because I think that this will probably be viewed by a lot of non-Ahmadi Muslims as well, and sometimes they take a lot of issue with our phrasing of Ahmadiyya as the true Islam. But I'd like to share that the thought process behind that, the thinking behind that, and the idea behind that is a benign one. It's a heavenly one, and it's that our compulsion, and especially my compulsion in joining Ahmadiyyat, is because we believe that Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad al-Islam is the Messiah and the Mahdi, foretold by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that his prophecies are found in the Quran and they're found in the Hadith. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has emphasized that when he comes, even if you have to cross over glaciers of ice, you should do that. You should be able to make that sacrifice and to make that journey and reach him and make sure that you pledge your bayat to him, because he's going to be the Khalifa of the time, the Mahdi of the time. Use the word Khalifatullah al-Mahdi, the guided one, and he'll guide us to the trials and tribulations of the time. So that is the idea behind it, and that's the compulsion that we have in joining Ahmadiyyat, and that's why we coin it as the true Islam. So let me start then, kind of just giving some background information, some introduction about myself. So I come from the city of Lahore in Pakistan. That's where I was born. It's the city where the promised Messiah al-Islam had actually passed away, and he had visited that city on many occasions as well. I was born into what I would call a mainstream Sunni family, although I would say that we were kind of very non-denominational, in the sense that we didn't really identify as Deobandi or Brahmi or any other denomination that I can think of. We were just kind of a mainstream, you can call it Sunni flavor, and kind of took religion more in a traditional sense, whereby you would attend Friday prayers from as often you can, and you would go through the Eid rituals. You would do a Quran reading. Somebody would come by, and a Maulvi or someone that you would be decked to for your reading of the Quran and everything. So in all those traditional sense, it was a pretty normal upbringing, a pretty normal discourse. Um, but the one thing that I also wanted to introduce over here as well is that, in fact, my grandfather was an Ahmadi. So he was the first Ahmadi in my direct line of the family. And he had some, I think, distant cousins and one brother or sister as well, out of a very large family who had also converted to Ahmadiyya. And um, he had basically followed them. And then I'm pretty much the second one after him who was accepted Ahmadiyya. And he was a late life convert. So it wasn't something that happened very early in his life, but both him and his wife, which is my grandmother from my paternal side, they were both Ahmadis. But this was a fact that was unbeknownst to me for quite a long time. I lived in one household early in my childhood in Lahore with them for some time, but really never came across Ahmadiyya being mentioned or being talked about in any detail or such. It was sort of a mute point. And I think, like kind of looking back at it now in retrospect, a reason for that might have been that there would definitely have been tensions around um, a conversion at that point in the family, because as we know from history itself, that anti-Ahmadiyyat movements and anti-Ahmadiyyat organizations within Pakistan have been very active for a very long time. And in 1953, for example, there were widespread riots, I think, throughout the country, a very well-known event, which were actually propagated and organized by one of the most senior clerics in Pakistan. His name was Maulana Maududi. I'm sure you've heard of him. I'm sure many people have heard of him. But this is somebody who has a very revered status among Pakistanis, and it's a very interesting event because after that event, there was some crackdown on what had happened, and in fact, he was arrested, and even a death sentence was pronounced against him because apparently he had actively issued pamphlets and literature targeting Ahmadis, um, perhaps even inciting a wajibul qatl or a liable for death kind of a fatwa against us. So you had those kinds of tensions that were going on at the time. This is 1953, of course, and then in 1972, you have the Constitution event, right, which is whereby the top government authority at the time goes into the main constitutional document of the country as an Islamic republic, and then singles out one community and says, well, these people are not Muslims because they don't believe that the Prophet Muhammad is the last prophet. So I kind of wanted to bring that point in as well because this is a very major misconception among non-Ahmadi Muslims, is that what they define us, or their primary definition of us, is that we don't believe that Prophet Muhammad is the last prophet. And we believe that prophethood is continued and other prophets can come, and somehow that subverts the authority of the Prophet Muhammad. Whereas actually, like I just explained, the main compulsion that at least I felt, right? And I think a lot of people that I've talked to who are also converts, that, why do you feel that you really had to do this? Even if you had to go through a lot of difficulties and a lot of sacrifices. And in my case, I don't think I really had to, although there definitely were some complications, and I'll mention some of them. But for the most part, that compulsion is driven by the fact that we believe Mirza Ghulam Ahmad al-Islam to be the prophet, not a prophet in that sense, but the prophet prophesied by the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So then, of course, that idea, that compulsion, um, that want, and everything just becomes all the more greater. And even though you see all these oppositions and persecutions and events like the one I mentioned in 1953, where I believe it's reported that more than 2,000 people had died during that time in those riots, and I think most of them would have been Ahmadis. So even with all this going on, and we know this from the history of prophets and history of true religious movements, that you have these kinds of persecutions and oppositions, and you still have a compulsion to do the right thing. So anyway, going back to my grandfather and my grandmother, I just wanted to touch on that really quickly because I have some recollection of that from childhood. Like I mentioned, that their conversion was kind of a mute point in the family at the time. At least I didn't come across it, but I do now vividly remember a couple of things. And my grandfather had mentioned something to me that in due time he will speak to me about certain aspects of Islam. And I think that's certainly what I meant. But I remember him very vividly. He was living a retired life when I was young. When I must have been, I don't know, maybe 6, 7, 8 at the most at the time. And I used to see him walking back and forth in like a small yard that we have next to the house, and he used to maintain that yard as well. But he had his tasbih, his rosemary beads, with him all the time. And I remember him that he would walk around, he would check out the plants and the grass and the flower beds, and then he would have that tasbih with him all the time, and he would always be, churning over the beads. And sometimes I would be in there in the yard, and he would approach me, or sometimes there would be people with me. And then what he would do is that he would look up at the sky and then look down at us, and then he would give like a no nod, like no. And then sometimes he would raise up his hand like that and still say that no, no one. So now I know like kind of what he was referring to, right? I think he was referring to that, still no one's come down, no one's descended from the skies, um, as is expected, or as it is idealized by the majority of Muslims around the world. So that is something that I remember very vividly. And then I remember, studying the Quran with him as well as a child. So those are, very cherished, very golden memories for me. And I think that gave me some very strong grounding for religion later in my life. But like I said, that, for the most part, religion, I think in my backdrop, in kind of the social environment that I grew up in, was more of a traditional thing, a cultural thing, that kind of happened around you, and you did because that's what everybody was doing. And then, you did the Eid festivities, and you did Jummah prayers every now and then. But it kind of remained at that surface level for quite some time. And one thing also that I'll touch upon that I remember is that kind of as I was growing up, this was a time, like I mentioned, religious ideas, extremism. Well, I wouldn't, not extremism like the way that we see it today, but I think people at that time still saw it as extreme. For example, the events that I just mentioned in 1953 and 1972. And there was always a lot of emphasis on, so I would call it like an intellectual inquiry, or criticism of certain religious beliefs, and sometimes even in religion itself. And I remember a lot of people in drawing room conversations, in dinner conversations, and things like that, where religion would sometimes come under criticism. But I think that was pretty valid then and even now, in the sense that people were mostly criticizing the events and the developments that they were seeing within religious institutions around them, and the kind of people who were taking over these religious institutions, and who were religious leaders of the time. So, like for example, I just mentioned Mulana Maududi, and I don't want to harp on it that much. But then, for example, you had Mufti Mahmud, who was there, sort of the chief cleric in the 1972 General Assembly deliberations that led to the constitutional amendment as well. So it's these kinds of events that were going on. And then there was also a lot of influence coming in from, outside of Pakistan, right, being imported in. And this has also been criticized a lot in, I would say, media reports and people who have examined the history of extremism, is that, some of these Wahhabi or Wahhabist influences that were happening at the time. So I think people were genuinely concerned. They were genuinely criticizing, and sometimes not really fully understanding the history of early Islam. Why did the early Muslims have to fight the battles and the wars that they had to fight? And that they actually stood for freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, and they brought that to, for example, Medina. And for example, when the second Khalifa, Hazrat Umar radiallahu anhu, had conquered Jerusalem, he made religion over there free for all for Christians. It was previously under Christian control, under Roman Christian control, but Jews were banned from entering Jerusalem by the Roman Emperor Heraclius before that. And then also Eastern Christians were under a lot of persecution in Jerusalem. And they were, once the Muslims conquered, they built an environment of freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. And this actually happened um, a lot more around in the area as well, and there's quite a few historical references around that. I'm kind of bringing this up. I'll touch on it a little later as well. That I've done a lot of study on it, and how after joining Ahmadiyya, I kind of got into the organization of Majlis Ansar Sultan al Qalam, which is the organization of the helpers of the Sultan al Qalam, which is one of the names that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala had given Hazrat Masih Maud Islam. And a lot of that research and that writing that I did from that time brought me, to this information, which was, a great relief and was very heartwarming. And I've also brought that information back to some of those people who were originally making those criticisms that early Islam has the seeding for what we're seeing in extremism today, which is a rhetoric and it's a narrative that we see a lot these days in the media. But anyway, I was kind of referring to, like, even in my not childhood, but I would say my early teen years, I came across those kinds of narratives in Pakistan, that religion is trending in a very, very negative direction. And there was then also a lot of emphasis coupled with that we people want to leave. They want to leave these kinds of these kinds of environments and these kinds of trends, which are running very negative, and go and seek a better life somewhere else where there truly is freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. And that's the West, right? That's over here. That's the United Kingdom and Germany and Canada and the United States and Europe and other places. And you and I, for example, are people. Our backdrop is in the Indian subcontinent, right? India and Pakistan. I'm not sure exactly where your backdrop is, but it's most likely going to be either India or Pakistan, right? And we're over here. You're in Canada. I'm here in the United States, because those societies and those communities and those trends just make life very difficult. And if you don't have freedom of expression, if you can't express your religion, if you can't even practice your religion, and just to give you an idea and to give the audience an idea of how negatively this trend moved, as the clerics really increased in their opposition of Ahmadiyyat, we went from the Constitution in 1972 to Ordinance XX. I believe that was must have been, I think it was early 80s, could have been 81, 82, but generally around that time frame. And Ordinance XX actually promulgates laws legal ordinances where if an Ahmadi Muslim is even so much as caught saying Assalamu alaikum or using any emblems of Islam, right, like reading the Quran or praying the Islamic prayer, um, and as I said, just even saying Assalamu alaikum, you can actually be jailed for that. The jail term for saying Assalamu alaikum is 3 years, and for reading the Quran, for example, is 6 years under Ordinance XX. So very extreme. And I won't go too much into the backdrop of, why these, what were some of the events behind these kinds of developments, and the dictators and the leaders. So over, I mentioned Mulana Maududi and Mufti Mahmood, and then you have General Ziaul Haq, who's widely known in history to have done a lot of Islam, what they call Islamization within Pakistan, but we can, in retrospect, look at that as radicalization as well. And he was sort of the chief architect of Ordinance XX and a very, very vehement opponent of the Ahmadiyya movement in Islam. And in fact, he had vowed to destroy it. That was kind of his openly announced vow against the movement. So naturally, when you have these kind of trends, you are going to look to leave and to go someplace where you can have a better education, you can have a better life, you can have a better career, and you can have that freedom of conscience. So those are the kind of things the kind of trends that I saw myself against, is that something is wrong with Islam, and things are trending very, very negatively. One should look to make a move. And during those times, it was at least comparatively today easier to do that. So my family really emphasized on it, and I think we started looking for my father did for opportunities out in the West, and eventually got an opportunity. And in my mid to late teens, I spent some time in boarding school in London. I spent some time in Switzerland as well, and then eventually, came out to the United States for education. So, the emphasis was more on, education, career building, and those kind of things. And that's pretty much what I focused on at the time. And religion and Islam kind of, I would say, drifted into the backdrop for quite some time. It stayed there in a traditional sense, I would say. And again, the rituals and the ceremonies were there, and you would go and you would do the Eid, and you'd look forward to getting gifts, and you would participate in the namaz. But again, like I said, it just was pretty much on the surface. So, fast forward a little bit to the time when I kind of get more close to my conversion event. When I'm in the United States now, and that's kind of where I decided to do my college, and also, kind of build my life after college over here. Uh, so, I think it may be a good point to touch upon 9/11 at this point. So I was here in the United States when 9/11 happened, and it was, of course, it's a very tragic event in many ways, in many senses. But one of the impact that it had on a lot of people, and especially a lot of Muslims in the United States, is that it kind of prompted us to look into the religion more deeply, and kind of just get beyond that surface level, that tradition level, and that ceremonial level, and try and understand what's going on. And that's primarily because religion came under attack, right? Especially when something that monumental happens on the soil that you're living on. It kind of happens very close to you. And I was actually in New York State. I was not in New York City at the time, but I was in New York State. And a lot of people that you work with, that you live with, that are around you and your neighbors, they start asking questions, right? And they start looking at you in a certain way. And, they're asking, well, is this what your religion is truly teaching? How is it that these people are motivated by religion and they're doing what they're doing? So at that point, it prompted me to look at the narratives more closely, look at the allegations a bit more closely, and to kind of start. I would say that was the beginning of the book process, or the reading process, or more of the examination process, right? And kind of did more of a translation reading of the Quran, and looking at some tafsirs, and looking at some writings and articles online with people who were trying to defend Islam at the time, versus people who are now bringing out verses from the Quran and saying, well, like, this is what it says in Surah Tawbah, verses 8 and 9 get targeted a lot in that area. And this is what it says over here, and this is what it says over here, and this is what these people are apparently following. And didn't this happen during the time of your prophet? And weren't there wars that were fought during his time? So, naturally, things of that nature. So, and at that time, I also found myself kind of getting more involved with the local mosques. So, up to this time, I'm attending mosques that are primarily mainstream, I would say, Sunni organizations and mosques here in the United States. And in the United States, of course, and I'm sure same in Canada as well, and mostly in the West, the structure of an Islamic community, or less an Islamic center, so to speak, is the term that we come across most, is very different from how it is back in Pakistan, right? Over there, it's an Islamic country. There's a mosque in every corner. You pretty much go to the mosque and you make your prayers, you do wudu, you make your prayers, and you come home. But over here, they're kind of more like community centers, where you go and you socialize and you host interfaith events, and you sometimes host events within the community as well. And there's speeches, and there's lectures, and there's all kinds of activities that are going on. So it's a lot more than just purely a place that you come to do salat. It was sort of a very active community center and a social center at the same time. Um, so I kind of found myself getting more and more involved in that kind of a framework. And then when 9/11 happened, it kind of drew the community within the centers even more than before, even stronger than before. I started coming across people and talking to people more about um, you know verses of the Quran, for example, hadiths, what certain religious scholars are saying, the narratives that we're hearing from places like in the East, from our home countries, where there are issues and there are problems, and there's some of these problems that, like I mentioned before, that I'm familiar with in the background. But even more extreme than that are these terrorist events that are now starting to happen, right? We had 9/11, but we had a whole string of events that happened even after that. And the heat is kind of being turned up and up. And there's more and more media narratives that are coming up that are actually attacking the very fundamentals of our religion, right? That there are verses and foundational texts, like in the Quran and the Hadith, which are apparently motivating terrorists and extremists. So it's at that point, when I'm trying to learn a bit more and trying to understand a bit more, and trying to get a bit more deeper and under the surface, that I am browsing on YouTube, right? Looking at lectures, um, you know, maybe something around Sheikh Hamza Yusuf or Yasser Qadhi, or one of these more popular YouTubers at the time. And I'm sure they are today as well. And I come across um, a sort of a YouTube suggestion, like you do on the side, and it has it's a Friday sermon of Hazrat Khalifatul Masih al Khamis. Talib bin Ahmad Aziz. So, what I mean by that, for our non-Ahmadi viewers, is the fifth Khalifa, the fifth Caliph after the promised Messiah, alayhi salam. So, we believe that Khilafat Haqqa, the true Khilafat, as the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam had prophesied, did initiate with the coming of the promised Messiah. As some Muslims who are more well versed in Islamic literature would know, that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had himself prophesied that Khilafat will continue in its pure form for about 30 years or so, but then it will kind of deviate, or it will dissolve in its pure form, and then it will, then the Muslim Ummah or the Muslim communities will go through several phases, of empires and certain kinds of kings, and in a very negative way as well. And then, after religion has suffered quite a lot over an extended period of time, Khilafat will be reinstituted, and it will come back. And this is also why Muslims historically, mainstream Muslims also use the term Khilafat al-Rashida, right? Because they want to segregate that pure Khilafat, which we believe that ended with Hazrat Ali radiallahu anhu, or perhaps with Hazrat Hassan radiallahu anhu. Some people extended to that as well. And after it went to, or at least the title was taken up by um, Amir Muawiyah, I think Muslim scholars would say that that was not Khilafat in its pure form, right? Because certain events that happened, and I won't spend too much time in that history. But we believe that the Khilafat then was reinstituted at the hands of the Prophet Islam, or I wouldn't say at his hands, but when he passed away, then the institution of Khilafat was instituted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that we believe that the current Khalifa is the fifth Khalifa in that chain of Khalifas. So I'm looking at, I get that suggestion, and on the YouTube, and I click there, and then all of a sudden, this whole thing with my grandfather is coming back to me, and it's I had, even before, thought about and resolved that what he was talking about. And around this time, when I'm much further, I'm now out of college, I'm in my, I'm working and everything, and I have a family and all that. Of course, now I know more about the history, that there was, Ahmadiyya is in the history of my family, but I don't still know too much detail about it. So, but I had thought about, that one day I'm going to look into this. One day I'm going to look into what prompted him to accept it, and to do what he did, and kind of what he was really getting at, when he used to scroll up and down, and he would look up at the sky, and he would look back at us, and he would give us that nod that we're all waiting, everybody's waiting, and still nobody's arrived. So that that khutbah, that sermon by Khalifa Khamis, this must have been around 2010, I would think. 2009. So another event that happened in my life, that was actually causing me to kind of dig more into religion and learn more about Islam at the time, was that I'd actually lost my job in the 2008 financial crisis that happened over here in the United States. I remember Canada was relatively unaffected by that crisis, but it was a huge mortgage crisis all across the country. And there were banks failing all over the place. And I worked at the bank, in a bank, and I owned a home at the time as well. And it was a mortgage crisis. So I was out of a job for a fairly substantial amount of time. But alhamdulillah, nothing too extreme or difficult happened. I was able to get my house into a mortgage refinancing program, a government program, and I was able to live off some savings, and some unemployment benefits at the time, for a period of time. So I definitely had to make some adjustments. We had to move, had to move into an apartment, leave the house, give the house on rent, try to use that rental income to pay for the mortgage and everything. But it was a shift, sort of a halt, a pause in my life, And as we know from the Quran as well, there are verses in the Quran where Allah says that these kind of events are going to happen in your life, and sometimes Allah makes them happen in your life, so that you can stop or you can take a pause from the rat race, so to speak, and reflect on your life, and reflect on the Creator and the creation around you, and hopefully that it brings you around, and makes the remembrance of the Creator and practice of religion a more meaningful thing in your life. So there's this going on as well. So it's at that time that I come across this khutbah, and I just remember that as being just a very uplifting, very powerful, very spiritual experience. It was, and just like describing his appearance as well, just had a very, very powerful effect on me. It was just sort of the overall appearance and the humility and the way in which he delivered the khutbah. There was something the word for me to describe it is heavenly, right? They're very heavenly about it, very, very powerful, very fundamental, like a nur, you would say. Like, for example, if you end up, if you use the expression that you see nur with someone, or you see a nur from someone, right? And we know that everyone doesn't get to see that, right? Everyone doesn't express that. And that happened with all the prophets, because all the prophets weren't also accepted, and in fact, in almost all cases, they were opposed and persecuted. So anyway, in my case, yeah, and even though I followed through from that khutbah um, with like a lot of reading of literature and listening to a lot of lectures online, and a lot more khutbah, but I just remember having this feeling, even in those very initial moments. This is the truth. I couldn't help that. And I myself, I'm very academic in nature, in the sense that, like I said, it was something that was very encouraged in the family as well, was to, examine and criticize and look at different viewpoints, and don't just follow religion blindly, and, look at what's happening around you. But I remember in that moment, it was just very powerful. And I kind of felt saying to myself that this man is not wrong. This can't be wrong. But again, that was a feeling. It was a very high sense of emotion. And even if you experience something like that, you should still follow through with it and do all the due research that you need to do. So, and I remember that khutbah, that particular sermon, was just purely about Surah Al-Fatiha. In fact, it was not even entirely about Surah Al-Fatiha. It was about 2 to 3 verses, and Khalifa Khamis in the Talib bin Aziz, I think, gave about 2 to 3 sermons after that as well, and some of them were about, I think, just a couple of verses. Like, for example, I think Iyaka Na'budu and Iyaka Nasta'in was itself a whole khutbah to himself, and he was referring to writings of the promised Messiah, who has, you know, written volumes and volumes on just like words, certain just words out of the Quran. For example, like these words that I was quoting. So I think it was a series of khutbahs, and I just hadn't in my life. I don't know if I had in my life before that had ever really been taken up by a khutbah, or been as impressed by an imam making a sermon. I think some I may have listened to attentively, but at that point I couldn't really recollect anything that I had listened to very attentively. But this one I was just kind of pulled into a zone, like like a twilight zone or something. And um, uh, and I was just very impressed in terms of how deep it was. Even just like with one surah itself, one very short surah, and just a few words in that surah, how deep he was going into each, all the aspects of it. And so from that point, I got introduced to, and at this point, I'm just researching by myself. I'm, starting to now look at more books as well, Ahmadiyya literature, books of the Promised Messiah, Islam, and more YouTube videos. And I get introduced just by looking at these videos and the suggestions to Khalifa Rabi, the fourth Caliph. So the preceding Khalifa or Caliph before the current Caliph, and he was the fourth. And as I would go on to discover, he was very, very active in terms of video, audio, video, and I think during his time, MTA I think was formulated and organized and launched, and he kind of had launched and really developed this whole platform of videos that could be then distributed and shared all across the world with Ahmadis and non-Ahmadis. And he had lectured on many, many topics, and also a lot on prophecies, right? And the prophecies of the Messiah, of the second coming of the Messiah, and the prophecies of the coming of the second coming of Jesus Christ, Isa ibn Maryam, as it is found in Hadith literatures. And that's when I kind of start building up an interest in the field of what's known as eschatology, which basically is just a study of end times, or it's a study of prophecy itself, or it's a study of an end state of a certain discourse. And he has many, many lectures on just this topic itself, and I'm just amazed on the depth of knowledge and the breadth of knowledge that he has, and also on the depth of knowledge that he's able to impart. So over a long period of time, I'm just sort of consumed and focused and just wrapped and kind of in this twilight zone, listening to lecture after lecture. And his explanation about the events of the, what the second coming of Christ means, and what this prophecy means, and why this prophecy cannot be literal, and why it has to be metaphorical, and all the supporting evidence in the Quran about the death of Jesus, Hazrat Isa alayhi salam, and prophecies related to that. So it's a pretty broad subject. I won't get into too much on that. But one thing that I'll mention as well is that I kind of really took on to the topic of what are the true events around the death of Hazrat Isa alayhi salam, and how the Christian belief itself developed after that. And the reason for that is that one of the first books that I read, I think the first one that I read was The Philosophy of the Teachings of Islam, which is a wonderful book. It's a great book. It's the foundational book that everybody should read when they convert into the movement, and it basically answers a lot of fundamental questions. But the second book that I read after that, I believe that was the second book, was Masih Hindustan, right, or Jesus in India. And again, it's like another knockout punch, right? For me, like first one with the khutbahs that I was listening to was kind of a knockout punch, and then after that, Khalifa Rabi's lectures and his writings and all this thing, and now reading this, and I remember when it happened was I was working at a company in Los Angeles, and it was a very slow day at the office. A lot of people were on vacation. And I'd been meaning to read this book, so I brought it along with me, and I just kind of stepped out of the office area into kind of where the cafeteria was, and just started opening up the first few pages. And I ended up actually staying there for a few hours because I couldn't put that book down. And what I really loved about it was just the very academic nature of it, and how the Prophet ﷺ gets into the biblical verses, right? So this is kind of my first exposure that I'm getting into his depth of knowledge of the Bible and the Old Testament and the New Testament. And he's actually using those verses and those biblical narratives to assert his point that Jesus did not die on the cross, right? And in fact, he survived the crucifixion. And we have a lot of verses in the Bible that we explain. We use to back up that explanation. And then he's using also Buddhist literature as well at the same time to talk about the prophecies of what he called the Bhagavad-gita, right? What's also known as the white traveling Messiah. So the prophecies of the Messiah, or let's say of Jesus, are also found in Buddhist literature, at least how we interpret it. And then he's also using medical literature, right, about Muhammad Isa, which was the ointment of Jesus that was applied to his wounds at the time when he was brought down from the crucifixion. This is in the biblical narrative, where Saint Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, two of Jesus' main supporters at the time, they bring him down from the cross, and they bring I think it's in John. I don't have the exact reference, but it's definitely is in the Gospel of John, and I think in the Gospel of Luke as well. That they bring about over 100 pounds of aloe and myrrh herb when they bring Jesus down from the crucifixion. And the writer of these verses in the Bible, which is written in Greek because it was later developed by Greeks, and they kind of warped into some different ideas, as we all know, about the deity of about Jesus becoming the Son of God, the begotten Son of God, and then God and all that. So a good explanation is that all these kind of Greek cultural influences came into it, and they kind of rewrote it and re-idealized it as something a little different. But that writer thinks that these herbs are for Jewish burial rituals, right, for embalming. But there is historically, it's proven there is no embalming in Jewish burial rituals at all. They're very, very different from what is being described in the Bible. So the Prophet Messiah Islam is explaining, that this is what was going on. They were actually preparing ointments to heal him, to resuscitate him. And it took about 3 days for that to happen. And then, since he was condemned, he was being pursued by the Jewish authorities and by the Roman authorities at the same time, he had to leave Judea. And he actually, to fulfill his heavenly commission of being the Messiah to the Israelites, he had to seek out all the tribes of the Israelites. So then he gets into Jesus's journey, going through Iran, and there were tribes of the Israelites over there, and through Afghanistan, and then through modern Pakistan areas, and India and Kashmir eventually is kind of where he ends up and settles. And then there are lost tribes of the Israelites that are all over these areas, and there are some historical and academic analysis on this as well. And the Prophet Messiah Islam actually talks about this. He talks about the tribes that even exist today. So he mentions, for example, Musa Kir in Afghanistan, which is the tribe of Musa, and Suleiman Kir, which is the tribe of Suleiman. And he mentions in Kashmir certain peoples who claim to be the descendants of the Israelites. So he uses, medical medical literature, medical history, Buddhist history, Christian history, even Islamic history. There are hadiths, which I was very, very astonished to come across in that book, which actually talks about, that Hazrat Isa was one of the most, how would I say, one of the most traveled prophets or human beings of ever, and that he traveled vast distances. There's even one hadith which he mentioned in his book, where I think Allah Ta'ala tells to Hazrat Isa alayhi salam that keep on moving, keep going, because he was apparently pursued at some point when he had to leave Judea. And this is in the Bible as well, because Paul, the famous self-proclaimed apostle Paul, as he's known in Christian narratives, he actually goes after Jesus, or he goes after the Christians, and starts persecuting them. And from Judea. So I think eventually he goes towards Damascus, right? And then on the road to Damascus is apparently where he has this vision where Jesus comes to him. Anyway, I won't get into all that, but he's being pursued, and there's a hadith that he mentions that, where Jesus is being told by Allah that, he needs to keep moving because people might catch up, and that, he's got to reach all the tribes of the Israelites. So amazing information. All these aspects of Islam, all this discovery is something that I had just never ever come across um, in all my childhood or my young years or adult years, and never had this kind of inquiry into religion. And I guess one of the most um, convincing, or maybe convincing is not the right word, but I would say one of the most aspiring aspects for me, one of the most founding aspects for me, was that it was all rational, right? It's all intellectual, and it's explained, and it's very cohesive, and it's coherent. It's not loose. It's not in pieces here and there where it's very difficult to connect it, which is what ends up happening if you're looking at a lot of these prophecies and these narratives about the second coming of Isa, and you're trying to interpret something metaphorically where other things literally, and it's very difficult to connect these things. And if you want to interpret one thing literally, then it's not consistent to interpret other parts of Hadith or Quran, um, not interpret them literally. And if you do that, you will get into situations where it's the interpretations and the meanings you're going to come away with are just going to be totally ridiculous and laughable, and nobody's going to buy that in the long run. And a little further on that, um, what was also very inspiring for me was that, and the promised Messiah Islam has said this, he said that one of his deputations from God, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is to reconcile religion and science. And we've seen this trend over the past century or a couple of centuries or so, where science and religion have kind of gone into a conflict with each other, and we have a lot of narratives, a lot of activism around that religion in general, whether it's Christianity or Islam, is not compatible with science. It's not compatible with progressive thought, because believing that somebody is living up in heaven for 2,000 years and was lifted up because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala apparently didn't have another option at the time to save him, and then he has to be sent back to settle a lot of unsettled issues. In a world um, you know where we're developing and kind of more gravitating towards scientific analysis and scientific thought and rational thought, and that things have to be able to be explained rationally, and be able to reconcile them scientifically. Those ideas are not tenable. They can't be defended. And now, actually, we even have organizations of ex-Muslims, and I think you must be familiar with this, since you're very active in social media and YouTube. I'm also very familiar with them, and I've also even talked and spoken with them on some channels before as well, ex-Muslims, and they always bring up these prophecies and these ideas amongst the Muslims as being totally irrational and unscientific, and that they can't be reconciled, and they can't be defended. So as I'm becoming more familiar with the edifice of Ahmadiyya and with the literature and with its soul and everything, I'm just absolutely loving the fact what Promised Messiah Islam said about reconciling science and religion and bringing it together. And when you read Jesus in India, when you read the book, and just the way that it comes across to you, the way he analyzes it and the way he discusses it, it's mind blowing. It's earth, the earth moves beneath your feet. Is the best way that I can describe that experience. So eventually, basically, um, I kept doing the exam, the readings, and the research, I would say. I think I did it for about a good 6 to 7 months or so. And then I decided that, it's time. This is when you have such a powerful experience with the truth, you have to commit yourself to it. Um, God is watching. you know, God forgive me. I have a lot of shortcomings. And Prophet Musa Islam has mentioned this as well. It's not going to happen. Like I mentioned, that the work continues, the path continues, the struggle continues in many ways. But when the truth comes to you, whether you feel that you're weak or you think that you're strong, you have to, in some sense, or in an absolute sense, commit yourself to it. If Allah chooses to reveal it to you, it's not for someone to dibble dabble around it and to say, oh, okay, I'll come around to it at some point or the other. So, I made the resolve. I got in touch with a local missionary over here, and kind of met with them, um, and we had a conversation. And I signed my bayah, alhamdulillah, in 2010. And yeah, there were a lot of commotion and complications in the family because of that, and with people I knew, and especially with the communities and the organizations, the Islamic centers that I had been working with and attending at the time as well. And much as I was very excited to bring this information to people, I was at the same time quite alarmed at the resistance, and sometimes just the pushback that you would get from this. That's very regretful, but at the same time, looking at it historically, um, this kind of thing happens. It's very consistent, uh, 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 like what I mentioned about the opposition and the persecution that all prophets have gone through. And we know that early Christianity also went through a very slow initiation process and a development process. And for the first 300 years, they were persecuted very severely under the Roman Empire, and they grew very slowly, but eventually they got there. And there's been other instances like that in history as well. So initially it bothered me quite a bit, but then it didn't as much. But I was very, very, very grateful, very, very thankful in terms of the information that Allah Ta'ala had definitely sent my way, and felt that I had to respond to it, and then I had to initiate myself, and then I had to commit to the work of Ahmadiyyat and to the development of Ahmadiyyat. And I guess one thing that I'll also mention is that as I did more and more research, because I heard this a lot from non-Ahmadi Muslims, and of course, this is very, very relevant to Christianity as well and to Christians as well, because um, the Messiah is awaited by billions and billions of people. In fact, not just Muslims and Christians, there are even other faiths that are awaiting the coming of the Messiah. But of course, it's a lot more amplified within Islam and with Christianity. As I got into it and I committed myself, I started doing more research and I started doing more writing. And I mentioned Majlis Ansar Sultan al-Qalam, which is an organization of writers, got more involved and started pitching letters to editors to get published in newspapers. So alhamdulillah, got some success over there. Started working with some blogs, and also got a lot of articles published in newspapers and local newspapers and other newspapers around in the country as well. And one of the things that I came across was that in my research during the time of Isa alayhi salam, so this is Jesus Christ, there was actually a lot of extremist violence and terrorism, very, very similar to what we're seeing today. So again, in a very similar sense, and how Hazrat Musa alayhi salam and Hazrat Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam are compared as prophets like unto each other, because they both dispensed a shariat, a very powerful shariat, the Torah and the Quran, and they were both followed. Their enemies were pretty much destroyed within their lifetimes, and they they were followed through with a very large empire. So there was a lot of war and battles after Hazrat Musa alayhi salam as well. So, for example, under Hazrat Joshua, there, that was kind of the beginning of the main Jewish empire, and then it kind of finds its peak, its zenith during the time of Hazrat Sulaiman, Hazrat Dawood, and Hazrat Sulaiman alayhi salam. And then after that, it's kind of a long, drawn out fall, a zawal, right? Um, uh, of the Jewish people. They come under the sway of different empires and different rulers from time to time. And kind of the same thing happens with Islam, right? We kind of follow through with Hazrat Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and the Khulafai Rashidin, and there's a great empire, and there's a lot of pride among the Muslims, as was there among the Jews. And then there is a long, drawn out depression, and then it comes to a low ebb. And both the Jewish and the Muslims at the times are thinking, what have we done wrong, right? What's happened to us? We were God's favorite people. We were God's chosen people, and we had the greatest prophets and the greatest books and literatures with us. How can we find ourselves in a position like this? And the reaction that came out of it, unfortunately, was a very negative, a very violent reaction. And they felt that they had to cleanse the Holy Lands. There were Jewish factions at the times known as the Zealots, for example, the Bandits, and the Sikari were one that I would like to mention, because the Sikari, the Sikari comes from the word for a dagger, and it was a dagger that they used to use to slit the throats and behead people, and they would do public, sort of public displays of this, right? In certain places, and this is in Jewish history, this is in Christian history, this is in modern academic history. This is not something that you really have to debate with anyone. And I even have references from writers and historians who have compared the Sikari with ISIS, explaining how extremism has occurred in religions before Islam as well. And these were just raw, die-hard, hardcore terrorist groups from the time. And Hazrat Isa's message to the Jewish people was that, this is a very famous verse in the Bible. He says, give unto Caesar what is due to Caesar, and give unto Rome, give unto Yahweh what is due to Yahweh, or he says, give unto God what is due to God. So the question that was posed to him was that, is resistance against Rome a religious duty? And he said, no, that's not a religious duty. Rome is not persecuting you on the basis of your religion. The temple, the main temple of the Jews, which is known as the Second Temple, which was eventually destroyed by the Romans um, because of the history back then, but they were allowed to practice their religion freely. And he gave the same message, which is the exact same message Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad Islam gave to the Muslims in India back then, is that, the British have just relieved you of your persecution from the Sikhs. So the Sikhs back at that time had some rule prior to the British, and there was a lot of Muslim persecution in the Sikhs. In fact, a lot of mosques were seized and were taken away, and they were being used as stables for horses and things like that. And the Muslims were not even allowed to call azan, the prayer to salat, and there were things like that. So the British, however you want to coin them, or to look at that period in history as occupiers in a political sense, but in a religious sense, they actually allowed an environment of freedom of religion. They had their own Christian missionaries over there who the Prophet Muhammad debated with, and they were making a lot of headway into converting Muslims into Christianity at the time. And when the British um, kind of made their policies on religion, a lot of these mosques were returned to the Muslims, as their rightful places of worship, and they resumed worship in these mosques. So Prophet Islam was saying the same thing, is that, these ideas, these radical extremist ideas are wrong. They're so wrong, and they have no basis in religion. You cannot just, without any context, compare that to what happened in the time of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who was attacked. They were attacked, and there was an attempt there to destroy the Islamic movement. That's not what's going on over here. So, the coming of the Messiah, and the second coming of Jesus Christ, and the extremist violence that we're seeing during this time, that's the context of the second coming of the Messiah. And there's a lot of prophecies around it, which we don't have the time to get into right now, which actually lend support that this is the time of the coming of the Messiah, right? And it's going to happen in a rational, historically consistent way. Yeah, it's not going to be somebody dropping down from the sky, with angels, holding a sword in his hand, and is going to go after the enemy, whether you want to call it the Dajjal, or you want to call it Rome, or whatever, because we know that from Allah's Sunnah, right? Allah says in the Quran, La sunnatullahi tabdila, la sunnatullahi tahwila. Says that my Sunnah doesn't change. So it's again going to happen in that consistent manner. So all these ideas, all these things just came together in a very wonderful way. I'm very thankful to Allah for showing me the light, for showing me the truth, for allowing me to be a part of this amazing time and this amazing movement, and this historically significant movement, of course. And I just can't come to terms with that. I can't explain that emotion, that feeling in words. But yeah, that there it is. Pretty much. I again, like I said, that I have a lot of work to do. Everybody has a lot of work to do. Um, I don't claim to be a saint or anything. My um, idea over here, my point over here was just to share some of these thoughts and share my own story. And inshallah, hopefully we'll follow through and communicate with people on this and bring these ideas up and talk more with people who are themselves engaged and exploring these ideas and exploring these events and exploring these narratives, and they're looking into Ahmadiyyat. And those who are really against it, and those who are questioning the very religion of Islam itself too. So Alhamdulillah, I'll stop there. I think I've gone a lot over than I even originally planned to go. I think I was trying to kind of compartmentalize everything within 30 minutes or so. So I'm twice over. I apologize for that, but I thank for everyone for listening. Jazakallah.
Jazakallah by really inspiring story, and it's amazing to see how much research you did before accepting Islam, Ahmadi, because sadly nowadays we see that the non-Ahmadi Muslims, they don't do research, they just pick up anti-Ahmadi books and blindly follow everything that's written in there. So it's really inspiring to see that you, alhamdulillah, did your research and found the truth. And today we thank you for your time, for giving us what you gave us today for this interview, and we pray that it helps others realize the truth as well, inshallah. Once again, Amer Bhai, Jazakallah for your time today. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
If you have not yet subscribed, make sure to subscribe and click on the bell icon so you can get notifications for every new video. Also make sure to like and comment on the video and follow on Twitter and Instagram.
نبينا صل على محمد صل على سفينا صل على محمد